My old homeowners association, spearheaded by the queen of overreach herself, decided to schedule and advertise a full-blown, fancy wedding at my ancestral ranch. The kicker? I hadn't even fully sold the property yet, and the main ranch house, the supposed venue, was literally days away from being demolished by my crew, under my explicit instructions as part of the land sale agreement. So, what's a guy to do when faced with such epic audacity? Well, let's just say the wedding planners, the happy couple, and especially the HOA president got a rather impactful surprise that morning. Drop a comment below if you've ever had an HOA try to pull a fast one. I'd love to hear your war stories, and definitely let me know where you're watching from. This tale of suburban warfare is, frankly, completely off the rails, and you're going to want to hear every last detail. My name is Alex Mason, and for the better part of my adult life, I've worked as a project manager, mostly in commercial construction. Timelines, budgets, contracts, and managing difficult stakeholders are my bread and butter. Little did I know that these skills would be so perfectly suited to dismantling the delusions of one Brenda Carmichael, president of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association. The property in question was Willow Creek Ranch. It had been in my family for over a century, long before Oak Haven Estates and its meticulously manicured lawns ever encroached on the rolling hills that bordered our land. The ranch house itself was, well, let's be generous and call it rustic. More accurately, it was dilapidated, a charming relic of a bygone era but far beyond practical repair. My grandfather had been the last to live there, and since his passing, it had sat empty, a silent testament to simpler times. The land, however, was valuable, prime for development, and after much soul-searching, I'd made the difficult decision to sell. A key condition of the sale, insisted upon by the buyer who wanted a clean slate, was that all existing structures, including the main house and a couple of crumbling outbuildings, be demolished and cleared at my expense before the final closing. I'd already signed with a demolition company, permits were in process, and the clock was ticking. Brenda Carmichael. Even saying her name now leaves a vaguely unpleasant taste in my mouth, like cheap perfume and entitlement. She was the undisputed, self-appointed empress of Oak Haven Estates. Picture this. Helmet hair so rigidly coiffed, it could deflect small arms, fire, a penchant for chunky gold-plated jewelry that jangled with every imperious gesture, and a pristine, pearl-white Escalade that she navigated through the neighborhood like a land-bound yacht. Her wardrobe was a masterclass in expensive but utterly tasteless attire, a desperate attempt to project old-money sophistication that invariably screamed recent lottery winner with a subscription to a bad fashion magazine. Brenda lived and breathed the HOA bylaws, or rather, her interpretation of them, which usually involved extending her dominion far beyond its legal boundaries. For years, she'd been a minor irritant, sending passive-aggressive notices about the visual impact of Willow Creek Ranch's unmanicured fence line on the Oak Haven aesthetic. Despite my property predating her precious HOA by generations and technically being outside its jurisdiction, I'd mostly ignored these missives, filing them under suburban melodrama. My property, my rules, or so I thought. The discovery that Brenda had escalated from petty fence line complaints to full-blown event management on my land came, as these things often do, through a bizarre stroke of luck. I was idly scrolling through a local community Facebook page, the kind filled with lost cat posters and passive-aggressive complaints about bins, when an advertisement caught my eye. "Host your dream wedding at the historic Willow Creek Ranch Pavilion," it proclaimed, accompanied by a surprisingly well-shot photograph of my dilapidated barn, cleverly angled to hide the worst of the decay, and bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. The pavilion, I should note, was a term Brenda had apparently invented. It was a barn, plain and simple, and one whose structural integrity I wouldn't trust in a stiff breeze, let alone for 100 wedding guests. The ad went on to list available dates, packages, and a contact number. The Oak Haven Estates HOA office, of course. My blood pressure immediately spiked. They were advertising my property, my collapsing barn, as a wedding venue, There was even a specific date highlighted for an upcoming wedding: Saturday, June 14th. That was less than 3 weeks away, and, more importantly, just 2 days after my scheduled demolition was due to commence. My first call was to Brenda Carmichael. I managed to get her personal cell from a long-suffering acquaintance who served on the HOA board under duress. Her tone, when she finally answered after 3 rings that sounded suspiciously like a cash register, was pure, distilled condescension. "Mr. Mason," she purred, as if addressing a particularly slow child, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" I explained, trying to keep my voice even, that I'd seen an advertisement for weddings at Willow Creek Ranch and that, as the owner, I was somewhat perplexed. Given that I hadn't authorized any such activity, and the structures were slated for demolition, Brenda actually chuckled. "Oh, Mr. Mason, always so literal. We in the community simply saw an underutilized asset, a charming, rustic eyesore, if you will, and decided to make it productive. It's for the benefit of Oak Haven Estates, of course. Enhancing the community's profile, generating a little revenue for our beautification fund. Frankly," she added, her voice dripping with faux concern, "making it look presentable for these events might even help your land sale. Think of it as free marketing." The sheer, unadulterated audacity left me speechless for a moment. She was treating my private property like a community garden shed she could just commandeer at will. "Brenda," I said, my voice now dangerously quiet, "that property is private. You are trespassing. And you are committing fraud by advertising services you have no right to offer on a property you don't control, especially one that won't exist in a few weeks." Her response was a sigh, heavy with the burden of dealing with such an unreasonable Luddite. "Really, Mr. Mason, such negativity. The community supports this. Perhaps you should be more community-minded." With that, she crisply informed me she had a very important HOA subcommittee meeting on petunia color palettes, and disconnected. My next call was to my lawyer, Tom Armitage, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who'd handled my family's legal affairs for years. After I relayed the conversation and the details of the advertisement, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, Tom let out a low whistle. "Alex," he said, "in 30 years of practicing law, I've heard some HOA horror stories. But this one might just take the prize for sheer unmitigated gall." He confirmed what I already knew. Brenda and the HOA were so far out of line they couldn't even see the line anymore. They had zero legal claim, zero right to access, and were indeed sailing dangerously close to fraud, misrepresentation, and a host of other actionable offenses. "Document everything, Alex," Tom advised. "Every email, every advert, every interaction. And let's get that demolition permit front and center. This isn't just an overreach, it's a declaration of war." The battle lines were drawn. Brenda Carmichael had mistaken my patience for weakness, my quiet ownership for abandonment. She was about to find out just how meticulous a project manager could be when his property, his family legacy, and his basic rights were on the line. The game, as they say, was afoot, and I had a very clear critical path to project completion. Tom Armitage, my lawyer, was practically salivating at the prospect of taking on Brenda and the Oak Haven HOA. "This isn't just about property rights, Alex," he'd said, a predatory glint in his eye that I usually only saw when he was cross-examining a particularly evasive witness. "This is about arrogance, abuse of power, and a level of entitlement that frankly boggles the mind. We're going to make sure they understand the concept of boundaries very clearly." His first order of business was to draft a cease and desist letter so forceful it could probably strip paint. But before we sent that, he wanted more ammunition. "Let them dig their hole a little deeper," he advised, a sentiment I wholeheartedly endorsed. My immediate task was to gather irrefutable evidence of their trespass and unauthorized activities. So, the following Saturday, under the guise of checking on the old place, I paid a visit to Willow Creek Ranch. The sight that greeted me was infuriating. Fresh tire tracks, definitely not mine, crisscrossed the overgrown driveway leading up to the main house and the barn. Near the barn entrance, I found a discarded glossy brochure, not the HOA's makeshift flyer, but a professional-looking pamphlet from Ever After Weddings, a local event planning company. Tucked inside was a preliminary floor plan sketch for Willow Creek Pavilion, Carmichael Henderson Wedding. So, they had actual clients. This wasn't just some vague notion of Brenda's. This was a live event in planning. The old ranch house was eerily quiet, but it felt violated. I decided then and there to upgrade my surveillance. That afternoon, I purchased a set of high-quality, motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use. They were discreet, battery-powered, and could upload footage to the cloud. I spent the rest of the day strategically placing them, camouflaged amongst the gnarled oaks and overgrown ivy, covering all access points and key areas around the house and barn. If Brenda or her cronies set foot on my land again, I'd know it, and I'd have them dead to rights. Back in my office, I double-checked the status of my demolition permit. It had been approved by the county the previous week. The date for commencement was firmly set, Thursday, June 12th. The advertised wedding, according to the Facebook ad and the planner's brochure, was Saturday, June 14th. The timeline was deliciously tight. My demolition contractor, a gruff but thoroughly reliable man named Sal Moretti, owner of Moretti Demolition, had already confirmed his crew's availability. I made a mental note to give Sal a heads up about the unusual circumstances. He was the kind of guy who'd appreciate the absurdity of it all. The trail cameras started paying dividends almost immediately. Within 2 days, I had footage of Brenda Carmichael's pearl-white Escalade pulling up to the barn. Out she swept, dressed in a flamboyant floral maxi dress and an enormous straw hat that looked like it could receive satellite signals. With her were 2 nervous-looking individuals who I assumed were from Ever After Weddings, clutching clipboards and tape measures. The cameras recorded Brenda with grand, sweeping gestures, pointing out various features of the decaying barn, the charming rustic beams, termite infested, the authentic vintage flooring, rotting and uneven, and the picturesque natural light holes in the roof. She was, in her element, playing the grand lady of the manor, completely oblivious to the fact that she was trespassing and orchestrating a fraud. The audio, though faint, picked up snippets of her conversation. Ample parking for guests. We can string fairy lights here. The catering tent can go over there, by those lovely, albeit slightly dead, rose bushes. I saved every clip, meticulously labeling them with dates and times. This wasn't just evidence. This was a highlight reel of arrogance. Tom, meanwhile, had been trying to get a copy of the actual contract the HOA was using for the wedding. His initial, politely worded inquiries to the HOA office were met with a wall of silence. Then, a curt email from Brenda herself. All community event documentation is proprietary to the Oak Haven Estates HOA, and for internal use only. We trust this clarifies the matter. It clarified only her determination to obstruct. However, fate, or perhaps just small-town gossip, intervened. My friendly neighbor from Oak Haven, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable who despised Brenda's reign, had a daughter whose best friend was a bridesmaid in the Carmichael Henderson wedding. Through this grapevine, a heavily redacted copy of the rental agreement made its way to me. Even with names and financial details blacked out, it was damning. It clearly stated Willow Creek Ranch Pavilion as the venue, listed the HOA as the lessor, and outlined services that simply couldn't be provided in a derelict, powerless, waterless structure. The fee, according to Mrs. Brevin, Gable's whispers, was a staggering $5,000, all payable to the HOA Beautification and Community Enhancement Fund, which everyone knew was Brenda's personal slush fund for her pet projects, like installing gold-plated handles on the community center's bathroom stalls. The internal monologue in my head during this period was a constant battle between incredulous laughter and simmering rage. How could anyone be so brazen, so utterly convinced of their own untouchability? Brenda wasn't just bending rules. She was manufacturing an entirely false reality and selling tickets to it. The sheer logistics were mind-boggling. Did she think a magical wedding fairy would descend and transform a condemned barn into a Cinderella ballroom overnight? The absurdity was almost as offensive as the illegality. My resolve hardened. This wasn't just about stopping a wedding. It was about holding Brenda accountable for her systematic abuse of power. Just to add another layer of irony to the proceedings, I received an official-looking letter from the Oakhaven HOA, signed by Brenda, of course. It was a formal notice of violation regarding the unkempt and potentially hazardous condition of the structures at 128 Willow Creek Lane, my ranch. It demanded that I take immediate remedial action to ensure the property is safe and aesthetically acceptable for upcoming scheduled community events. The hypocrisy was so thick you could spread it on toast. I carefully filed this notice with my growing mountain of evidence. It was almost poetic. Her own letter demanding I fix up the place she was illegally renting out, a place I was about to legally demolish. The HOA board, as far as I could tell, were little more than Brenda's trained poodles. I'd tried briefly to reason with one of them, a timid accountant named Gerald, during a chance encounter at the grocery store. He'd simply wrung his hands, stammered something about Brenda knows best, and community cohesion, and scurried away, clearly terrified of incurring her wrath. They were enablers, pure and simple, complicit through their cowardice. But my primary target remained Brenda. She was the architect of this farce, and she would be the one to face the consequences. The week of the scheduled wedding end, my scheduled demolition arrived with a palpable sense of tension, at least for me. For Brenda Carmichael, it seemed to be a week of blissful, ignorant, C-suite level event planning. My trail cameras were working overtime, capturing a flurry of activity at Willow Creek Ranch. Florists in vans, clearly lost and confused, were seen wandering around with measuring tapes, trying to figure out where to hang garlands on beams that looked like they'd collapse if a strong gust of wind blew. Caterers, looking equally perplexed, poked around the non-existent kitchen facilities, no doubt wondering how they were supposed to prepare a gourmet meal with no running water or electricity. And at the center of it all, like a particularly self-important queen bee, was Brenda. She'd arrive in her Escalade, usually wearing something flowing and impractical, directing the befuddled vendors with imperious waves of her hand. "The champagne fountain will go here," I imagined her declaring, pointing to a patch of particularly vigorous poison ivy. "And the string quartet can set up under that magnificent, ancient oak." Yes, the one with the large, ominous-looking hornet's nest. The footage was almost comical, if it weren't so infuriating. By this point, Tom Armitage had unleashed his masterpiece, the cease and desist letter. It was a thing of legal beauty, 5 pages of tightly worded prose that outlined, in excruciating detail, every single one of Brenda's and the HOA's transgressions. It cited property law, trespassing statutes, contract violations, and even hinted at potential criminal charges for fraud. It explicitly stated that Willow Creek Ranch was private property, that all structures were scheduled for imminent demolition under a valid county permit, a copy of which was attached, and that any attempt to access the property or hold any event thereon would be met with immediate legal action and, if necessary, police intervention. We sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to Brenda's home address, the HOA office, and to each individual board member. We also hand-delivered a copy to Ever After Weddings, the unfortunate event planners caught in Brenda's web of deceit. Their panicked phone call to Tom later that day confirmed they were pulling out, citing misrepresentation by the HOA, one less variable to worry about, though I did feel a pang of sympathy for the bride and groom. Brenda's response to the cease and desist was, predictably, dismissive. She didn't even deign to reply directly to Tom. Instead, I received a short, incredibly smug email from her personal account a day later. "Mr. Mason," it began, "I have received some rather histrionic correspondence from your legal representative. Needless to say, Oakhaven Estates stands firm in its commitment to community enrichment. The Willow Creek Ranch Pavilion is a treasured local landmark, and its use for community events is overwhelmingly supported. Any attempt on your part to interfere with the Carmichael Henderson wedding on Saturday will be viewed as a malicious act of vandalism and neighborly sabotage. We trust you will see reason and refrain from any disruptive behavior. The bad publicity alone should be a significant deterrent for you. The sheer, unadulterated gall. She was doubling down, accusing me of potential vandalism for wanting to demolish my own building on my own land, while she was actively trespassing and defrauding a young couple. Her confidence was astounding. She genuinely believed she was untouchable. I did, for a fleeting moment, consider trying to contact the Carmichael Henderson couple directly to warn them. They were, after all, innocent victims in Brenda's elaborate fantasy. But Tom advised against it. Let Brenda hang herself with her own rope, Alex, he said. Contacting them now might just muddy the waters or give her an opportunity to spin some new narrative. Our focus is on stopping her and the HOA. The fallout for the wedding, unfortunate as it is, will be part of the consequence she has to face. He was right. My primary responsibility was to protect my property rights and uphold my contractual obligation to deliver a cleared site to the land buyer. The day before the demolition, Wednesday, June 11th, I met with Sal Moretti and his foreman, a burly, taciturn man named Gus. We walked the site of the old ranch house. Sal, a man of few words but much action, took in the decaying structure, then looked at me with a questioning arch of his eyebrow. I laid out the whole bizarre story. Brenda, the HOA, the phantom wedding venue, the cease and desist, her utter refusal to back down. Sal listened intently, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face as I spoke. By the time I finished, he was chuckling. "Boss," he said, shaking his head, "I've been in this business for 40 years. I've torn down crack houses, mansions, and everything in between. But demolishing a wedding venue on the morning of the wedding, while the HOA president who booked it watches, that's a first. That's beautiful." We finalized the plan. His crew would arrive pre-dawn on Saturday, June 14th, wedding day. They'd position the heavy equipment quietly, out of sight from the main road if possible. No work would commence until I gave the signal, likely after Brenda and the first wave of wedding personnel arrived, and the situation had been clarified. "We'll be discreet until go time, Alex," Sal assured me, clapping me on the shoulder. "Then we'll be very, very efficient. That old barn won't know what hit it." His eyes twinkled with a mixture of professional pride and pure, unadulterated mischief. He was clearly looking forward to this. The night before, Friday the 13th, felt appropriately ominous. I was a strange mix of anxious and grimly determined. Sleep was elusive. I kept replaying various scenarios in my head, checking my folder of evidence: the deed to Willow Creek Ranch, the notarized demolition contract with Sal, the county-issued demolition permit, copies of the HOA's fraudulent advertisements, screenshots of their Facebook posts, the video clips from my trail cameras showing Brenda's multiple trespassing visits, Tom's cease and desist letter with the signed receipt proving Brenda had received it, and even her latest threatening email. This was my arsenal, my smoking gun collection. My trail cameras showed some late-night activity: a van, not from any recognized vendor, furtively dropping off a few stacks of folding chairs, and a rather sad-looking archway made of plastic ivy onto the porch of the barn. Amateurs, clearly. Probably some of Brenda's desperate, last-minute attempts to create a wedding out of thin air. I meticulously saved the footage. Brenda was not just going to be proven wrong, she was going to be exposed, comprehensively and spectacularly. The stage was set for a showdown, and I, for one, was ready for the curtain to rise. The dawn of Saturday, June 14th, broke cool and clear. A perfect day for a wedding, or, as it turned out, a demolition. I arrived at Willow Creek Ranch well before sunrise, parking my truck on an old, overgrown access road a few hundred yards from the main house, concealed by a thick stand of pines. The air was still, carrying the scent of dew-damp earth and the faint, melancholic aroma of decaying wood from the old ranch. It felt like the calm before a storm, a particularly noisy, diesel-fueled, debris-generating storm. Sal Moretti and his crew were already there, true to their word. Two massive excavators and a bulldozer were strategically, and surprisingly quietly, positioned just out of sight behind a collapsing stone wall that once marked a paddock. Sal, looking remarkably chipper for 5:00 a.m., gave me a thumbs up from the cab of his pickup. He was sipping coffee from a battered thermos, a faint smile playing on his lips. The anticipation was almost a physical presence. We were waiting for the guest of honor, so to speak. It wasn't long before the first vehicle crunched up the gravel driveway. A sleek, black sedan. Out stepped a woman in a severe business suit, clutching a tablet, her face a mask of harried efficiency. The wedding planner, presumably a replacement for Ever After, or perhaps one brave or foolish enough to ignore their warnings. She took one look at the dilapidated barn, then at the overgrown surroundings, and her expression faltered. She began pacing, muttering into her phone. Next came a florist's van, followed by a catering truck. Their drivers looked equally bewildered as they surveyed the scene, a far cry from the historic Willow Creek Ranch pavilion promised in whatever doctored photos Brenda had shown them. Sal, a big, imposing figure in his work boots and reflective vest, ambled over. I watched from my vantage point as he politely but very firmly informed them that the property was private, closed for the day, and undergoing imminent demolition. Confusion turned to dismay, then to frantic phone calls. The wedding planner was practically vibrating with stress. Then, the pièce de résistance, the pearl-white Escalade. It swept up the driveway with its customary arrogance, parking at a joinery angle that blocked half the access. Brenda Carmichael emerged, a vision in a powder-blue mother-of-the-bride dress that probably cost more than my first car, her helmet hair immaculate, a triumphant, proprietary smile plastered on her face. The smile froze, then shattered, as her gaze fell upon Sal, then flickered past him to where the snout of an excavator was just visible. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "What?" she enunciated, each syllable dripping with ice. "Is the meaning of this?" "I am Brenda Carmichael, president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. There is a wedding scheduled here today. You people need to leave immediately." This was my cue. I strolled out from behind the stone wall, my evidence folder tucked under my arm. "Actually, Brenda," I said, my voice calm and level, "there isn't a wedding here today. This is still my property, and this," I gestured to Sal, who gave a courteous nod, "is Sal Moretti, from Moretti Demolition. We have a fully authorized, county-issued permit, and this house, along with that barn you've so creatively renamed, is coming down, starting today." Brenda's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from confusion to disbelief, then to a shade of puce I hadn't thought humanly possible, finally settling on incandescent rage. You can't!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. This is sabotage! I'll have you arrested!" "I'll sue you for everything you own, you miserable little man. You are ruining a wedding. You're a monster. A vandal." She was practically hopping with fury, her expensive dress quivering. She lunged towards Sal, as if she could physically stop him. Sal, to his credit, just stood there, arms crossed, looking mildly amused. Brenda whipped out her phone, screeching, "I'm calling the police. You'll see. They'll drag you out of here in handcuffs." True to her word, 2 county sheriff's deputies arrived about 15 minutes later, looking less than thrilled to be involved in what was clearly escalating into a major neighborhood drama. Brenda, now teary-eyed and playing the victim, rushed towards them. "Officers, thank goodness. This man," she pointed a trembling, bejeweled finger at me, "is illegally trying to demolish this historic building. He's trying to ruin my daughter's friend's wedding. He's trespassing." I calmly stepped forward and introduced myself to the deputies. "Officers," I said, opening my folder, "this is my property. Here is the deed." I handed it over. "Here is my valid, county-issued demolition permit, effective as of 2 days ago." I presented that next. "And here," I continued, "is a copy of a cease and desist letter, sent by my attorney and received by Ms. Carmichael and the Oakhaven HOA 5 days ago, explicitly warning them that this property was scheduled for demolition and that any planned event was unauthorized. I showed them the signed return receipt. The senior deputy, a man with a weathered face and tired eyes, examined the documents carefully. He then looked at Brenda, whose tirade had momentarily paused. "Ma'am," the deputy said, his voice devoid of sympathy, "it appears Mr. Mason is well within his legal rights. This is his private property, and he has a valid permit for demolition. You and the wedding party are, in fact, the ones trespassing. I suggest you vacate the premises immediately." Brenda looked like she'd been slapped. But the wedding, the guests, the community." The deputy just shook his head. "That's a civil matter between you and the wedding party, ma'am. Right now, you need to leave Mr. Mason's property." Just then, a limousine pulled up, followed by a string of cars. The bride, looking radiant but increasingly anxious, emerged with her father. Their faces fell as they took in the scene: the demolition equipment, the police cars, Brenda Carmichael mid-meltdown, and me, standing there like the grim reaper of wedding dreams. Brenda rushed over, trying to spin some tale of my sudden, inexplicable villainy. The bride looked utterly crushed. Her father, a stern-looking man, approached me. "What in God's name is going on?" he demanded. Quietly, I explained the situation, showing him copies of the cease and desist and Brenda's own smug email dismissing it. His face darkened with fury, but it was directed squarely at Brenda. "You knew?" he seethed at her. "You knew this was a possibility, and you let it get this far?" The poor bride burst into tears. It was a genuinely awful moment for them, and I did feel a pang of regret for their ruined day, but Brenda had forced this confrontation. Sal chose that moment to give the signal. With a mighty roar, the first excavator lurched forward, its massive bucket swinging towards the old, dilapidated porch of the ranch house. With a sickening crunch of splintering wood and shattering glass, the porch roof collapsed. The demolition of the historic Willow Creek Ranch Pavilion had officially begun. Brenda let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob, watching her grand illusion crumble into literal dust. The irony was so thick you could build a new, much sturdier barn out of it. Wedding guests, arriving in dribs and drabs, were greeted by the sight of heavy machinery tearing apart their venue, a truly unforgettable start to what was supposed to be a joyous occasion. The demolition proceeded with impressive efficiency. Sal Moretti's crew were professionals. They knew how to bring down a structure quickly and safely. The rhythmic crunch of wood, the groan of stressed timbers, and the roar of diesel engines replaced any semblance of wedding day serenity. Within a couple of hours, the old ranch house, Brenda Carmichael's historic Willow Creek Ranch Pavilion, was reduced to a dramatically smaller pile of debris. The barn, her prized rustic venue, was systematically dismantled, its termite-ridden beams crashing to the earth with satisfying thuds. The wedding, needless to say, was irrevocably cancelled, or at least catastrophically derailed. I imagine frantic phone calls were made, attempting to find an alternative venue at the 11th hour, but the damage to Brenda's reputation, and the HOA's, was already done. Local social media, as one might expect, exploded. Neighbors who had witnessed the commotion, or had heard the sounds of destruction echoing through Oakhaven Estates, were posting bewildered updates, then gleeful condemnations as the true story began to leak out, largely thanks to a very chatty Mrs. Gable who was providing live commentary to anyone who would listen. The fallout for Brenda was swift and brutal. The bride's family, understandably enraged by the deception and the financial loss. Non-refundable deposits for caterers, florists, musicians, all booked for a venue that was never legitimately available, immediately threatened legal action against the Oakhaven HOA and Brenda personally. The sum they were talking about was not insignificant. It covered not just the venue fee they'd paid to Brenda's beautification fund, but also all their other sunk costs. Suddenly, the HOA's insurance premiums were looking very vulnerable. An emergency HOA board meeting was convened that very evening. I didn't attend, naturally, but Mrs. Gable, who had a surprising number of covert allies on the board, gave me a detailed, almost gleeful, play-by-play the next morning, over coffee. Apparently, Brenda had tried to brazen it out, blaming me for unneighborly malice, blaming the demolition company for aggressive tactics, even blaming the wedding planners for not doing due diligence, the one she hired after the first company bailed. But no one was buying it. The evidence of her deliberate deception, particularly Tom Armitage's cease and desist letter, which several board members now admitted to having seen and been worried about, was undeniable. This is where a minor character, previously an enabler, had a change of heart. Gerald, the timid accountant I'd encountered at the grocery store, finally found his spine. Perhaps it was the threat of personal liability as a board member, or maybe just the sheer unmitigated disaster Brenda had caused. But he stood up. He produced emails Brenda had sent to the board downplaying my objections, assuring them she had it all under control, and that my claims were baseless posturing. He even had records showing she'd authorized payment from the HOA account to a dodgy, unlicensed event stylist, her cousin, it turned out, for preliminary venue enhancements at Willow Creek Ranch, enhancements that, of course, never materialized. This reformed insider testimony was the final nail in Brenda's coffin. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her incompetence, deceit, and potential misuse of HOA funds, the board had no choice. Brenda Carmichael was forced to resign as president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately. There were even whispers that she might have to make personal restitution for some of the financial damages to avoid a more protracted and embarrassing lawsuit, though I never got full confirmation on that. Her pearl-white Escalade became a much rarer sight in the neighborhood, and when she was seen, the imperious air was noticeably diminished, replaced by a sort of hunted, deflated look. Her reign of suburban terror was well and truly over. The positive changes in Oakhaven Estates were almost immediate. A new, far more reasonable interim board was appointed. They immediately initiated a full review of the HOA's bylaws and financial records, promising transparency and accountability, concepts alien to Brenda's regime. The beautification fund was audited, and several of Brenda's more outlandish vanity projects were quietly shelved. The community, by and large, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. My actions, born out of a desire to protect my own property, had inadvertently triggered a much-needed house cleaning for the entire neighborhood. As for Willow Creek Ranch, Sal and his crew completed the demolition and site clearance ahead of schedule. The land was pristine, a clean slate, exactly as my buyer had requested. The sale closed without a hitch a few weeks later. The new owner, a developer with plans for some tasteful, low-density housing, actually thanked me for resolving the HOA situation so decisively before he took possession. Looking back, the whole affair feels like a surreal fever dream. The sheer audacity of trying to run a wedding business on someone else's condemned property still boggles my mind. It taught me a valuable lesson, though. Never underestimate the lengths to which entitled people will go, but also never underestimate the power of meticulous preparation, irrefutable evidence, and a well-timed demolition crew. There was a grim satisfaction in watching Brenda's meticulously crafted facade crumble, both literally and figuratively. It was a stark reminder that reality, eventually, has a way of asserting itself, sometimes with the help of an excavator. So, that's the story of how I ended up orchestrating the demolition of a wedding venue on the morning of the ceremony, and in doing so, accidentally liberating an entire neighborhood from an HOA tyrant. What's the absolute craziest, most over-the-top HOA story you've ever encountered? I genuinely want to know. Drop your experiences in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this tale of entitlement, getting its just desserts, do me a favor and hit that like button, and maybe even subscribe for more stories of bureaucracy battled and justice served. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.